A 999 call is received in the morning and a woman is making the call to say her neighbour believes his partner may have died. She says he thinks that the partner isn't breathing and may have suffocated.
A few minutes later, paramedics arrive on the scene. When they get there, they identify the woman as Susan Nicholson. Rigor mortis has already set in and her face has turned purple, so she's clearly been dead for a few hours.
There were signs that people had been drinking, such as bottles around the living room. For the police officers attending this scene, they didn't treat the incident as particularly suspicious or consider it particularly out of the ordinary. Susan Nicholson had separated from her husband and moved down to Worthing. They had 2 children.
Susan had a successful career working for a number of banks in London and was a loving mother to her 2 sons.
Susan suffered from alcoholism and started to attend a support group for alcoholics in the Worthing area. It was when she was at this support group in Worthing that she met Robert Trigg, and the pair of them started to build a relationship.
Robert Trigg was father of 1 child. He was a chef and he was also a cleaner part-time.
He was also an alcoholic. He had a lot of problems with drink. A lot of his relationships with women revolved around alcohol.
At 46, Trigg was 6 years younger than Susan, but the pair hit it off and their relationship developed quickly.
When they left rehab, they did continue to stay together. Susan came into some money and she bought a flat and they both moved in together.
Generally, her life was going better than it had been for a few years. She was getting over the breakdown of her marriage. She'd got a new relationship.
So it seemed to be going very well. She even introduced him to her parents, Elizabeth and Peter.
They bumped into each other in a charity shop where Susan was working in the town centre. Susan's parents were slightly concerned on meeting Trigg the first time because he seemed to be under the influence of alcohol quite early in the morning. Susan's parents knew she'd struggled with alcohol and they could see that her new partner was suffering some of the same demons.
As the months went by, cracks began to appear in their relationship.
The pair obviously had a sort of dysfunctional relationship in that they obviously drank together. It created quite a volatile situation. By April, there were obvious signs that Susan Nicholson and Trigg regularly drank together. The pair were seen out buying alcohol and Trigg was spotted by a neighbour staggering around in the driveway outside their home.
They seemed to be used to seeing them drunk or drinking, and for them to go and buy 2 bottles of vodka and plan an evening of drinking probably wasn't out of the ordinary for them.
Emergency services received a call from a woman saying her neighbour had found his partner unconscious on the sofa.
Is she awake?
No, she's not. He told me he's not.
She's not, and she's not breathing?
No, that's what he said.
Okay, and did he find her like this?
He literally phoned me. I was still in bed asleep, and he phoned me just now saying I think Sue's dead, so I came down and he's just told me that she is.
Yeah, alright. Okay, could you ask him just to tell you why he thinks it looks like she's dead?
Rob, why do you think she's dead?
I think it could be suffocation.
He thinks it could be suffocation.
Okay, and what? From what?
From what?
We both crashed out on the first last night. I woke up this morning. I had that way she went down.
Right, okay, did you...
No, I didn't hear what...
They both crashed out on their sofa last night. Rob woke up with his head at one end, but Sue's face was like in the middle of the sofa, like where the cushion's joined.
In an initial call like that, the operator will be trying to get as much information as they can. You can hear the operator being a bit confused. You can hear in the background of the call a man's voice. This turned out to be Robert Trigg. Emergency services maybe thought that he couldn't make the call himself and that he was in shock.
The emergency services may have expected they were going to a fairly routine death call.
Although the call went to the ambulance department, the fact that there was a death would mean that police would automatically be called.
The woman's body was found on a smallish two-seater sofa in the middle of the room.
They noticed that there were 3 empty vodka bottles at the address, and maybe they thought that the alcohol could have contributed to her sudden death.
Officers took a witness statement from Robert Trigg at the scene.
Robert suffocated in the middle of the night.
Susan was only 52. She didn't have any obvious health issues that could have caused her to die as she did. How did she die?
Following Susan Nicholson's death, her body was removed and sent for a post-mortem.
I was asked to attend an address in Worthing and take a statement from a resident living in the flat above. When I arrived, Susan had been taken away and there was nobody there in the flat itself. I noticed it was a nice flat. There was even a nice fresh bowl of fruit on the table. There was no sign of any scuffle or anything like that. Nothing was broken. Coincidentally, there was a receipt from a hairdresser's that took my attention. She had had her hair done the day before she had passed away. Because I recognised the hairdresser's she went to was the same as the one I would go to, it kind of brought it home a little bit more, really.
A statement was then taken from the neighbour who had called 999.
The young lady that lived in the flat above Susan Nicholson's flat was visibly shocked and very upset, bless her. She told me that Susan was her friend and she kind of took her under her wing a bit and looked after her. She said Robert Trigg was living with Susan and that they often had arguments that she could hear.
The case was passed to the coroner.
It's very difficult, in my opinion, for someone to be asphyxiated in the way that Robert Trigg is described. But there's not very much evidence to indicate another reason why Susan may have died at that time, and therefore he is given the cause of death as being due to accidental smothering.
The news came as a huge shock to Susan's parents.
Mr. and Mrs. Skelton were very unhappy that this case was being closed. They couldn't understand how their daughter could have met her death. How was she accidentally smothered? How could this have happened to them or to anyone?
Susan's parents pressed for answers. Despite their daughter's death being ruled as non-suspicious, they discovered that this was not the first time police had dealt with Trigg.
Shockingly, they found out that one of Trigg's previous girlfriends had died in similar situation as their daughter Susan.
Julie Cox had been one of the uniformed officers who attended that scene.
The partner, Robert Trigg, I had encountered 5 years before at another scene of another sudden death. I felt that it was very unusual for one person involved in 2 sudden deaths, as it was. After taking the statement from the young lady in the flat above Susan Nicholson's flat, I returned to the police station and sort of said, that's really odd, isn't it? Same man and very similar circumstances, which does seem rather strange. I didn't have any more involvement. I believe that Robert Trigg was interviewed by other officers.
When Mr. and Mrs. Skelton found out that he had a partner who died in a similar situation, they found out that her name was Caroline Devlin. They wanted to ask more questions. They needed to know what happened, and they also needed to know what the links were between the two.
Caroline Devlin died in 2006, and her death was treated as non-suspicious. For 5 years, the case remained closed, until the death of Susan Nicholson drew new attention to the incident.
Caroline Devlin was a single parent. Her marriage had broken up, she had 4 children, and she moved to the Worthing area to be closer to her brother.
When they moved in, we knocked on the door and said, if there's anything you need, we're right next door. And she had a lovely family. She was a lovely lady. She was a very easy lady to get on with. Very happy-go-lucky. Absolutely adored Caroline. In fact, the whole road was very protective towards Caroline. She was very friendly, but she had kind of a vulnerability about her.
Caroline met Robert Trigg in a local pub in Worthing, and the couple began dating.
I knew that Caroline had a boyfriend, but we didn't learn anything much about him, which I suppose speaks volumes in itself.
She did mention him, but only in passing.
I'm nosy. So I did want to meet him, so it was nice that she brought him in to meet us. When we met Robert Trigg, I found him very much alpha male, but he seemed pleasant enough. She was well into him, obviously, and I was pleased for her that she got somebody.
The couple dated for nearly 3 years, but friends began to notice a change in Caroline's personality.
Sort of mellowed down a little bit, wasn't quite so gregarious.
We weren't as close as usual. I wouldn't say she was withdrawn, but I didn't see so much of her.
Family and friends grew concerned, and in March 2006, just weeks before Caroline's death, they witnessed Trigg turn physical.
Trigg grabbed her arm aggressively. When her niece asked her about it later, Caroline said it wasn't the first, it won't be the last. And prophetically, she said, I probably won't see him 40th.
It just came out of the blue. I don't think I'm going to live my full life. I'm pretty sure that I'm going to die young. It came out of the blue and she never said it again.
On the 25th of March, Caroline, Trigg and a group of friends go to a pub nearby. They're having a good time. Then Trigg and Caroline goes to a neighbour's house.
They came in fairly late in the evening. And we knocked back quite a bit, I confess.
They weren't over amorous or anything like that, but they just sat next to each other, enjoying themselves. Trigg wasn't overly talkative, whereas Caroline was fairly chatty. That's how we spent the night.
They left at about 1 o'clock in the morning and went home to bed.
I arose between 8 and 9 o'clock. Went downstairs, started making the coffee. I was halfway through it, and a knock on the front door. And I could see one of Caroline's kids standing there, so I answered it. And he said, I can't wait, Mum. Can you have a look? I went next door. Trigg was sitting on the settee, staring at the floor, not saying a word. So I went upstairs to the bedroom. She was laying there. I sent the kids out of the room, downstairs. There was no physical marks on her, but it did seem strange that she was in bed with no sign of any bedclothes. I checked for signs of life. Nothing. There was no signs of pulse or anything like that, so she was starting to discolour, which means she'd been dead a few hours.
She'd been with us, happy and laughing, just a few hours before, and now I'm told that she's dead. It just didn't seem real. It didn't seem possible.
One of the most shocking things about Caroline's death was that her death occurred on Mothering Sunday. Her children found her on Mother's Day.
They cooked her a Mother's Day breakfast. Of course, when they went up to take it to her, they found her dead in bed. Well, I did ask Trigg if he'd phoned the service. He seemed to answer. He might have mumbled something, but I certainly couldn't understand it. So I phoned the emergency services, explained to them what had happened. They said, right, we'll send somebody out.
As emergency services made their way to the scene, Trigg appeared to get agitated.
I was very upset. I'd lost a very dear friend. So I was totally wrapped up in my own. I wanted to cry and I couldn't because I had to look after Robert. And I was worried for him because he was in a state of shock. He got that, what soldiers call the 1,000-yard stare. He was just off into oblivion. And he wanted to leave. And I said, you can't leave, Robert. You can't leave until the police have been and gone. Because they may want to talk to you. You were with her when she died. You can't leave. And I was trying to reassure him, because he really was in a state of shock. It didn't occur to me that he was concerned for himself at that stage.
When paramedics arrived, they pronounced Caroline dead at the scene. Julie Cox was one of the first uniformed officers to arrive.
There was a man in the living room who identified as Robert Trigg. He was very cool and calm and collected. He was sitting down, smoking a cigarette, reading his newspaper, and that kind of surprised me, because if he was having a relationship with Caroline, then I would have expected him to at least be showing some sort of emotion, but he showed no emotion at all. That I thought a bit strange, but then I thought, well, people are different. I joined my colleague upstairs and found Caroline Devlin. I could see that she was naked on the bed. She had her feet where the pillow should be, and her head was at the feet of the bed, and she was laying on her front.
Caroline appeared to have been dead for a number of hours. Julie Cox, then a police constable, questioned Trigg about his movements that morning.
He got up, got dressed, and went to the newsagents and came back home again. He said that he'd got the eldest son to go upstairs and wake his mother up. But obviously Caroline was dead. I mean, I was a mum at the same time, and, heaven knows what my two children would have done.
Caroline's son went next door and asked the neighbours to call the police.
I did think it strange that Robert hadn't called the police, but on the other hand, I think he was just quite simply in a state of shock. I thought he was just quite simply in a state of shock. What would you do? I don't know how I would have reacted if I'd woken up next to a dead person.
Caroline's death was deemed non-suspicious but unexplained, and referred to the coroner to determine cause of death.
The routine autopsy pathologist in this case had performed the post-mortem upon Caroline's body and found that there was bleeding within the head around the brainstem. And so they concluded that Caroline had an aneurysm which had ruptured, that had bled around her brain and caused her death.
Caroline's death was ruled to have been due to natural causes, and the case was closed.
It was a few weeks before we were told what they thought had happened to Caroline, and they said it was an aneurysm. It certainly fitted the circumstances, particularly as she'd been drinking. So we accepted it as one of nature's nasty freak accidents. Didn't think anything more of it.
It was certainly an unusual set of circumstances, but no one could have expected that a sudden death in Worthing could have turned into a double murder spanning several years.
5 years after the conclusion of the investigation into Caroline's death, the parents of Susan Nicholson couldn't understand why such a similar incident had not raised concerns about their own daughter's death.
If Trigg had been searched on the Police National Database, that should have played a part in the investigation and alerting the investigating officers of suspicions around Susan's death.
One key similarity involved Trigg's behaviour in the immediate aftermath of both incidents.
They've got two women who died whilst in his bed or on a sofa, and situations where, upon discovering their bodies, instead of doing anything constructive, he goes to a shop.
After Susan had died, he'd phoned his brother at 8:33 in the morning. At 8:47, he spoke to his neighbour, who actually did call the police because he said that Susan was dead. But he didn't actually call police himself or call an ambulance at all.
And Susan's parents had more questions about Trigg's version of events.
They have their suspicions, primarily about the size of the sofa. Two average-sized adults didn't seem to be able to comfortably sleep on this narrow sofa. Trigg is a heavy-set guy, weighs 15 stone. They didn't see how it was possible for two people to be asleep on this sofa at the same time.
We knew it wasn't an accidental death, so we couldn't give up because we knew that Trigg had murdered Susan.
In March 2012, less than a year after their daughter's death, Susan's parents discovered that Robert Trigg had sold his story to a magazine.
The Skeltons must have been devastated to see his article in which the man that they suspected of being involved in their daughter's death is playing the victim, effectively. They have to read details where he's claiming that they helped each other with their alcohol problems.
When I was with Susan, the world seemed a better place. I had no urge to drink.
He says that Susan wanted to marry him. This didn't add up for them because they knew that their daughter told them that she never wanted to get remarried again, and they'd heard evidence in the inquest about both of their heavy drinking.
We often slept covered up on the sofa. I had no idea it could be so dangerous.
But they knew that a previous girlfriend had also died in similar circumstances.
They keep asking the question why. Why did the police do what they did? They gave Robert Trigg preferential treatment, and they treated Susan as if she was of no consequence.
For 4 years after Susan's death, the Skeltons put pressure on authorities to reopen their daughter's case.
They kept contacting Sussex Police, asking for an investigation. They also wrote numerous times to the IPCC, who are the Independent Police Complaints Commission, but with the same result every single time.
We think the police and the authorities did let
Fail us,
Susan down.
yeah, they failed us and failed Susan.
Yeah.
After multiple failed attempts to get Sussex Police to reinvestigate Susan's death, Peter and Elizabeth Skelton contacted a barrister to take a look at the case.
They were convinced that their daughter had been murdered, and so they were very anxious to see whether there's any other route they could take in order to push forward a prosecution. They were then in their late 70s, but they both had very strong minds. They felt like they were crying in the wilderness because it was almost like that the world had gone mad because it seemed so obvious to them that he was the killer.
I think what the Skeltons were trying to achieve is almost impossible. They are two normal people who have lost a child. For them to take on an institution to try and get justice for their daughter is no mean feat. And it takes a lot of courage, integrity, and fight.
They told me about Susan, for a start, and I'd already seen pictures of her and read about her, and she was obviously a really lovely woman. Lovely family, close family, lovely people. And they were able to point out certain features of what had happened that day and preceding that, which seriously alarmed them. The thing I really remember at the forefront of my mind was the sofa. It was a very narrow sofa. The dynamics of what he said happened made absolutely no sense, because in order to have caused her to suffocate, it would have required something which didn't make sense, because he would have fallen off the sofa. The fact was that Sussex Police had concluded that they were not simply going to reopen this investigation, and so the way to do this was to start a private prosecution.
It was a great relief. It was like opening up a new gate or a new door or something, because, you know, we waited for so long and we did so much hard work and the police weren't listening to us, and at last somebody took us seriously.
His original account to police, he had said that he was lying on the sofa with his back to the back of the sofa, and that she was next to him there. But then when he gave evidence at the coroner's hearing, he had to explain how it was that he got up at 2 o'clock in the morning, went to the toilet and came back again. And he said he got back into the same position. Of course, that would have meant waking her up, and he said that she had made no response. So he changed his account, and he said that he was now on the outside of the sofa, and so that was a completely different account.
Matthew Farmer was also told about a series of domestic incidents in the months leading up to Susan's death.
Where there is domestic violence, I think it is something that's absolutely fundamental to understanding who you're dealing with, and to making decisions such as whether to treat someone as a suspect.
Across just 3 months, police were called twice when loud arguments were overheard coming from the flat. By their third visit, the situation had escalated.
When the police officers attended, they actually saw Susan with 2 black eyes, a swollen nose, a cut to her arm, and bruising to her chest. Trigg had no option on this occasion, so he had to say, "Yes, I caused those injuries."
Trigg received a caution for battery, and the attending officers were left concerned that that Susan was in danger of further harm at his hands.
The officers recorded it as a moderate risk. It was downgraded to standard back at the station, even though she had all of those visible injuries. It was less than a month later that they would reattend, and she would be dead.
Despite growing evidence suggesting Trigg may have played some role in Susan's death, police refused to reopen the case. One key reason for this was Susan's autopsy.
The pathology report says that she's died from accidental smothering, so their investigation's finished. The police have already made their minds up.
That's a problem that had to be dealt with because he was the only expert witness in the case at this point. So what I advise they do is go to a Home Office pathologist called Dr. Nathaniel Carey, or Dr. Nat Carey.
He reviewed the original pathology report and concluded that the cause was deliberate.
Susan Nicholson's death has occurred from traumatic asphyxia. In other words, she has died because someone else has been applying pressure to her, deliberately.
There were imprint marks on her lips showing that extreme force had been used, and that could not have happened accidentally.
Dr. Carey also highlighted that it would be very unlikely for Susan to have been accidentally smothered in the way Robert Trigg described.
She wouldn't be able to breathe, so she would wake up and try and remove herself from that situation.
As soon as Nat Carey came up with that, the report from the previous pathologist that the police had used was not only neutralised, but there was a very strong opinion from an extremely eminent Home Office pathologist saying that the cause was deliberate.
For Mr. and Mrs. Skelton, this was a turning point. There was now enough to reopen the investigations.
Much to the relief of Susan's parents, Sussex police agreed to reinvestigate the deaths of Susan and Caroline Devlin. Dr. Carey was asked to review Caroline's original post-mortem, which had ruled her death was due to natural causes.
He has identified that, in fact, she is unlikely to have died from a natural aneurysm. Dr. Carey concluded her death is due to a blow to the back of her head, causing a bleed around her brainstem. So after reviewing Susan Nicholson's death and also Caroline Devlin's death, he's identified that there are suspicious activity in both deaths.
There are issues of looking at these two reports together. The similarities in how they died, how they were found, and their partner. You cannot ignore those coincidences. They are not coincidences. They are something that has happened because of that common denominator. Trigg.
Robert Trigg was taken into custody and questioned under suspicion of murder. Julie Cox had already retired from the police when she heard the news.
It certainly gave me flashbacks as to my involvement with both incidents. As a police officer, unless I can see there's a knife sticking out their back, I'm not qualified to decide whether somebody has died naturally or any other way. So it's down to the pathologist to follow that up. But it did seem unusual for somebody to be involved with two deaths in that. So I was glad that at least it was being reinvestigated under those circumstances. Hopefully justice was going to be done.
In light of Trigg's arrest, the 999 call reporting Susan Nicholson's death took on a more sinister edge.
Now, they'll probably be looking at it with a different view, because whereas before they might have viewed him as a grieving partner, they might now look at him as a potential killer.
Is she awake?
No, she's not. He told me she's not.
She's not, and she's not breathing?
No, she's sleeping.
Okay. And did he find her like this?
Yeah, he literally found my arm still in bed asleep. And he phoned me just now saying I've been Sue's dead, so I came down and he's just told me that she is.
The call itself is shocking. For me, it just sounds like he's very manipulative. Trigg is using people around him as a smokescreen. He's got somebody else who's going to tell the same story, and it's almost corroboration.
Okay, could you ask him just to tell you why he thinks it looks like she's dead?
Rob, why do you think she's dead?
I think it could be suffocation.
He wasn't asked that. He was asked why do you think she's dead, and he sort of volunteered this narrative of suffocation, sort of out of nowhere.
He's implanting that idea into the heads of the first responders.
He thinks it could be suffocation.
Okay, and what, from
What's from what?
We both crashed out the first night, so I woke up until my head up where she
He's talking about the position on the sofa and how they fell asleep and how he's ended up. It is almost like he's presenting his defence straight away.
This is almost like a playbook where it worked for him in the past, and so maybe he thought that it would work again.
In December 2016, Trigg was charged with the murder of Susan Nicholson and the manslaughter of Caroline Devlin. Susan's parents were one step closer to justice for their daughter.
I was delighted. Their hard work now over 5 years had paid off.
They had plenty of opportunities to stop Robert Trigg because he had a history of violence going back years and years and years, you know. And so they could have stopped Robert Trigg well before he got to Susan.
The charges against Trigg came more than 10 years after the death of Caroline Devlin.
I'd got over the shock of her death, and now I was being told that there was a possibility that it wasn't a natural death after all. I thought back to the way he was reacting on the morning when he sat with me, and it had a totally different meaning. It fitted either scenario, whether he was shocked because she died unexpectedly, or whether he was shocked and wanted to get away because he'd actually been the cause and didn't want to get caught by the police. I was shocked that they hadn't looked into it. It took someone else dying in the same way to find out what had really happened to Caroline.
The trial of Robert Trigg began in June 2017 at Lewis Crown Court. If found guilty of murder and manslaughter, he faced life in prison.
It was important for prosecutors to link the deaths that were 5 years apart.
On both occasions, he went shopping. Those are not the actions of somebody who is distraught, who's just been through a traumatic experience. That's somebody who is planned, controlled, unemotional.
The only real differences between the two deaths was the manner in which Trigg killed them.
Susan Nicholson had died of traumatic asphyxia, and Caroline Devlin had died from a blow to the back of her head. The common denominator here is Robert Trigg. He's there when both women have died.
In order to back up the conclusion from the pathology reports, the prosecution needed to demonstrate that Trigg was a serial abuser.
Part of the prosecution's case was to submit what's called a bad character application. That's where prosecutors will apply to a judge to be able to bring up past crimes and police reports and anything that they think speaks to the character of a defendant.
Prosecutors presented the jury with evidence of multiple previous incidents with former girlfriends, where Trigg had become violent.
One of these incidents that prosecutors put to the jurors was that Trigg beat up another previous girlfriend so badly that she was in hospital for 3 weeks. During that incident, it was actually him that called police and said, "You have to come down here and arrest me or I'll kill her."
Caroline Devlin's neighbour was called to testify about Trigg's behaviour in the aftermath of Caroline's death.
I could not help thinking back to that morning and what he had been like, and it just all made total sense. He wasn't alarmed that somebody had died, he was alarmed that he had actually killed her.
And the cross-examination started. And that went on for quite a time. And eventually concluded, I think the defence lawyers were not overly happy. Robert Trigg, yeah, he was subdued and staring into space. I had to go walk in front of him, where he'd been sort of leaning forwards and looking at the floor. He's raised his head, sort of nodded, and a smile that was sort of hollow.
One major problem for the prosecution was the length of time that had passed since both deaths.
It would have been more difficult to provide real, tangible evidence, and the defence team would have used that to try and undermine that prosecution case.
One element of Trigg's defence centred on the number of years that had passed between the various domestic incidents highlighted by the prosecution.
He claimed that there wasn't as many abusive incidences as you might see in other cases. It was only a few incidents over a long period of time.
That is not an excuse. That is not acceptable. And even when you say there's a small number of incidents over a long period of time, a small number of incidents that were reported, but what about the ones that were not reported?
During the trial, Caroline's children testified. It must have been horrendous for them to have to go through that.
That to me is the most shocking thing. They're never going to forget seeing their own dead mother on Mother's Day.
What would you say to the families of the women that you killed? You sent children to find their mother's body.
Isaiah 15 verse 11. They should be in the
After a 10-day trial, it took jurors just 6.5 hours to convict Robert Trigg of the manslaughter of Caroline Devlin and the murder of Susan Nicholson. Robert Trigg was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 25 years.
Really, it's cost us a lot of sleepless nights.
Again.
We blame the police for this because we've told them for 6 years all the facts, but they just wouldn't listen.
A new inquest into Susan's death was opened. It looked at Sussex Police's investigation into Caroline's death and the way they responded to the information they had about Trigg prior to Susan's murder.
So the jury unanimously concluded that Sussex Police had information that should have alerted them to the fact that Robert Trigg posed a real and immediate risk to Susan Nicholson's life, and that the police had failed to take reasonable steps to protect her. The jury also found there were significant failings in the investigation following the death of Caroline Devlin.
We hope the Sussex Police will reflect on all the conclusions and ensure that victims of domestic violence and their families are better treated in future.
Sussex Police accepted the findings of the inquest and apologised to the families of Susan and Caroline. They vowed to improve the way in which they respond to cases involving domestic abuse.
It was a remarkable vindication of the Skeltons' long-standing and patient efforts to achieve justice for Susan and for the truth to come out. And of course, without Peter Elizabeth Skelton's determined campaign, the family of Caroline Devlin would never have discovered the truth about Caroline.
I will always remember Caroline as the most bubbly person I've ever met. She and I laughed a lot. And that's the way I will always remember her.
The job of the police is to keep our communities, our people, our families safe. The police failed, but what the Skeltons did, they took a...
Tonight, a money-making Ponzi scheme leads to murder from the last person you'd ever imagine.
Indeed, David. I just came back from reporting on this story. So many people left heartbroken and mystified. And all new 2020 begins right now. Tonight, the trial so many have been talking about, with details you haven't heard until now.
It was just greed after that.
What is this weird nightmare
that's visited upon this couple? She's sick and now he's dying. For him to just go from being fine to suddenly comatose. What happened? What happened?
They were a great couple. They loved each other. They always wanted to be together.
Two people with no background in federal contracting. Suddenly they're going to be arms dealers for the federal government.
They were trusted in the community. A lot of the investors were family and close friends.
Had Michael expressed any doubts about the business?
The Cochran business model seemed to be built on defrauding their friends and family.
Investigators look at you and say there were never any contracts, there were never any bids, it doesn't exist.
When people found out, they want answers.
I mean, it was all anyone could talk about. Your friend, 38 years old, is gone. Behind all the raw beauty in the untamed West Virginia mountainside are deep-rooted secrets, lies, and betrayal, and a small, close-knit community is upended.
I was just calling to see if you knew when everything surrounding the investigation is going to be over.
I don't understand what you mean by the investigation.
They're asking people very personal questions about me and my husband's relationship, but I just can't keep living this way.
And at the center of all that unraveling is this couple, the Cochrans.
It was on a Tuesday night on December the 23rd, 1980, 10:36 p.m. Michael Brandon Cochran was born into the world.
Tell me about Michael as a boy.
He was a good kid. He always minded me. You know, Eddie came into his life when he was 8 years old.
When I met Michael, he had like a rat tail haircut and with the spiked hair. We just kind of developed a good, warm relationship.
What about sports, though? And he was really into sports.
Oh, yeah. He was playing like the pee-wee baseball. You could just tell right then. He just took to it and was just like a natural.
Michael Brandon was always playing baseball, basketball, football. He lifted weights as a hobby. He had a weight bench in his room. He got his first Sandfield barbell set around 10 or 11 years old. And he would just go in there and turn his music up loud and start working out. He just loved being healthy. Of course, he loved the muscles. He loved the way it made him feel. In high school, they started having like powerlifting competitions. And Michael, he got first place. We were really proud of him.
At age 17, Michael meets a girl named Natalie Jessup, also 17, during a trip to the mall. It will change his life forever.
We had to go out to the sporting goods place one day, and there she was working behind the counter. And she was flirting with him really bad, you could tell that. And the next thing I know, they were dating.
She seemed to be a relatively driven student in school. She was passionate about what she did. She loved her family.
After high school, both Michael and Natalie head off to West Virginia University, where he studies computers and she studies to be a pharmacist. The two freshmen had just started their first semester at WVU when Michael's mom, Donna, gets a call from Natalie.
They got engaged in November of 1999. And when Michael got on the phone, I just said, Michael Brandon, what in the world are you doing?
Were you happy for him to be marrying Natalie?
I wanted him to wait. He had just graduated high school like maybe 5 months before. And I wanted him to just, focus on his schooling. And then 6 months later, they were married.
The couple are the picture of happiness in their wedding photo. After graduation, they later have 2 children. And after 6 years of marriage, they settled in Daniels, West Virginia, here in this colonial home.
It's a beautiful home on almost 4 acres of flat land. Michael renovated that house. He just completely gutted it and remodeled it from top to bottom.
As the years went on, did they have a happy marriage?
As far as I know, they had a happy marriage.
Yeah, they're starting their life now, and starting their family. They've got good jobs.
Natalie was working as a pharmacist, and Michael was in IT.
Yes, information technology. Yeah, it was like running cable wire, coaxial cable, and things like that.
I think West Virginia can kind of be summed up as here people really focus on work, family, and their faith.
How was Michael as a dad? He was a proud dad. He doted on his kids and was a good provider, was involved with them, the school activities and stuff.
The couple gets involved in their community.
He was a football coach and he was a baseball coach.
And wherever Michael was, you'd find Natalie working the sidelines.
She was a sports socialite. When Michael was the coach, she was the one you got all the information from. She was the one that ordered the uniforms and got your sizes.
He loved sports, and that was probably our biggest connection. Our family would see their family at games, and that's really how it got started, is just loving sports and hanging out.
Are there stories that you remember that when you really do think back to you all as couples, it kind of warms your heart that you remember?
Oh, yes. Mike and I, we won a lot of championships together, coaching our kids.
Chris and Jennifer Davis bonded with the Cochrans over Little League, their young families, and church. They even went on vacations together. Chris, a lawyer, was hired by Michael for a legal matter, and the two became friends. What was it that made them sort of fit into your world?
It was really the family aspect. They were a great couple. They loved each other. They always wanted to be together. We gravitate toward friends who are always together and love their spouses, because we're always together.
You were really close.
Yes, we were very close.
So at some point then you discover that one of your sons has diabetes.
Initially it's very grim because it's, hey, this is what this is. It's never going to change. And this is what it's going to require.
Coincidentally, Natalie happened to specialize in diabetes management. How helpful was that for you in the beginning?
Tremendous.
She was amazing. Like, she just gave us all the information we needed because you learn as you go.
So she understood how insulin could affect the body.
1,000%.
Then, seemingly out of the blue, the Cochrans make a career change and open a new business. So they seem to be doing well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. They're doing very well.
I invested and I spent $256,000.
And this new venture will lead them straight to the CIA.
Everybody is very involved with their kids around here, into sports, and that's where parents usually hang out, at school sporting events.
Just like his dad, Michael Cochran's son loves sports, especially baseball. And it's a family affair, with Michael coaching local youth sports leagues. Natalie became treasurer of the middle school baseball program.
She was heavily involved in that because Mike was a coach. They were involved in tons of leagues and different things.
So you were all involved as friends in the sports world with your children?
Yes, that's correct.
We met the Cochrans because I had put my son into the draft for the Little League Baseball.
Toni McCall met Michael and Natalie after her husband died of leukemia, leaving her a single mom to 3 children.
Michael very much took on a father figure role, especially for Cash. He was so good to him. He took him everywhere. They went fishing. They went to practices. It was a dream come true to have that father figure when you don't have one for your kids and you want one.
The Cochrans are a busy couple, both on and off the field. They open a business that is supposed to provide supplies to the federal government. It's called Tactical Solutions Group, or TSG, and they soon begin looking for big investors to help them pay the upfront money that is sometimes needed for government contracts. And to everybody's surprise, Natalie up and quits her job as a pharmacist, jumping into the business completely.
Great. I mean, if you can quit your job as a pharmacist, like, oh, wow.
By all accounts, the new business appears to be flourishing.
They were building onto their house, and they put up a new fence. Mike got a car.
So they seem to be doing well.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. They're doing very well.
Natalie tells friends they were inspired by that movie War Dogs, the one about 2 men with no experience in the defense industry who become arms dealers to the U.S. military and get in way over their heads.
They call guys like us war dogs, bottom feeders who make money off of war without ever stepping foot on the battlefield.
When she told me that we're going to make all of our employees watch War Dogs as like an onboarding video, I said, well, you do realize that the guys went to jail, right?
It might surprise people to know that any civilian can seek a government contract. All you have to do is register, and then you start bidding. It can be a small business, an individual, a nonprofit agreeing to provide goods or services to the government at a specific rate at an agreed upon time.
The process is you discover the contract, you bid on the contract,
and if you're chosen, suddenly you're in business with the U.S. government.
The Cochran's website for their business, TSG, boasts impressive clientele from within the government, including the Department of Defense, FEMA, Homeland Security, and the CIA.
Tactical Solutions Group was supposed to be a whole goods seller, so they could sell healthcare equipment, masks, firearms, and various things like that.
Michael Cochran would spend hours sifting through all of these government contracts, and he would tell Natalie what he'd found. She'd go to the investors and say, Michael found the most incredible investment.
What did you know about what this business was all about?
They got this niche, a woman-owned small business. The idea of the federal government will pay $50 for a $10 hammer. You just got to be able to get in there and get the contracts and fight with the big guys.
And All the couple needs now is a little startup cash.
Most of their investors were friends, family, people that they knew.
We invested $245,360.69. That was our retirement savings.
Michael's mom, Donna, remembers the first time Natalie approached her about investing in the family business.
Do you remember what she said?
Yeah, she asked us if we wanted to do the government contract. She said that she wanted to help us out, when we got ready to retire.
At what point did you decide that maybe this was something you might be interested in getting involved in?
About a month later, she told me that she was doing it for her parents, that they'd made $60,000 in 5 months. And so we thought, well, maybe we'll give it a try.
That's a pretty good return.
Yes, ma'am. It sure is.
Donna Bolt says her daughter-in-law claimed she could get her initial investment back with profit, sometimes in as little as 10 days.
So when they come to you for a potential investment, what's your initial thought?
Well, my initial thought was, sure.
The Cochran's close friends, Chris and Jennifer Davis, say the couple approached them after church saying they needed some major cash to fulfill a contract for dental labs, saying if they didn't get the money right away, they'd lose the entire contract.
But it was more than just, hey, do you want to invest? There were supposed to be dental facilities on military bases. That's why we couldn't see any of the documents. Because she knew I was going to ask that. I was like, what's the well, you can't see it. You don't have authorization. We can't do that because it's Department of Defense. And so we were like, sure. Yeah, man, we'll help out.
How much were you investing?
$511,000.
When Chris Davis hears who's investing, he says it seems like a safe opportunity.
I trusted all those names and people in the community.
So if they were involved, it must be sound and good.
Absolutely. The names that were lining up, it fit. Like, okay, these people aren't going to do anything crazy.
Tony McCall says the circle of trust was how she too decides to invest.
She had pulled someone in that I was close to and had been getting him to do contracts.
She says that person calls one day with an opportunity for the two of them to go in on a contract, but they've got to do it immediately.
It pays out in 45 days, but you have to do it right now. Like eBay, she bids at the very last minute so that nobody can go in and bid over top of her. But you have to tell me right now. And so I did it. I spent $256,000.
By all accounts, it seemed to be a safe bet. The Cochrans appeared to be doing well.
I had seen the money that they were spending.
They had multiple vehicles, they had motorcycles, they were buying trips overseas.
The Cochrans are living the high life, but then suddenly the Youth Sports League is broke.
This ain't good. I really felt in my heart that something was going on.
You don't have anything, it's all spent.
Could something be afoul at the Little League? In the small community of Beckley, West Virginia, after just a year, Natalie and Michael Cochran's business is doing very well. And family and friends notice the couple seem to be too.
It appeared that Natalie and Michael were quite wealthy, and they were living like they were.
They had multiple vehicles, they had motorcycles, they were buying trips overseas to Paris, they went to Hawaii.
We just thought it was wonderful. We just thought they were doing so good that we were so proud of them.
I mean, they had 3 homes, a pickup truck, motorcycles, a nice antique car.
Him and Natalie drove up in a 1965 Shelby Cobra. It was a kit car. It was just something that they bought, and we were just very happy. We even took a ride in it.
They were living much higher than the majority of people in West Virginia.
Did you see a difference in how their lives seem to be changing?
Oh, yeah.
You were on vacation together. What kind of vacations did you take?
We did beach vacations, and then we went to New York City a couple of times with them.
Yeah.
And so the typical sightseeing, shopping.
Everybody got along?
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
it was fun.
It was great.
It was a lot of fun.
From the outside, it appeared that a lot of the spending was on Michael's side.
This was wealth that he had not experienced before, so he wanted to take advantage of it. Some of the things that Michael Cochran purchased in this period were recreational vehicles, an airplane hangar. He had ambitions and endeavors to open up an aviation branch to this business.
He really, really wanted to fly, and he loved that type of stuff. He was working on his pilots. Now, he wanted to fly helicopters.
They were a great couple to get that kind of money. They were doing things for people, and I mean good things.
Michael especially was doing a lot of charity work. He donated a weight room to a local middle school. When he found out his youth pastor was going to be homeless for a while, he actually purchased a property for him to live in.
Natalie even gets involved with local organizations and charities.
She volunteered, wanted to do this and wanted to do that.
She was helping us with juvenile diabetes research, all the fundraisers for that. And then we did a 5K run. She was good at that. She would organize it, get sponsors, get the word out.
One time she and Mike were at the house and she told me that they were going to buy a town in Africa because that was going to be their mission, pay for everyone's home and build homes.
Natalie also helps raise money for the middle school baseball league. Their friend Chris is board president.
We had a fundraiser, and from the fundraiser, we believe we raised a little over $15,000. It was a big deal.
As treasurer of the Little League, Natalie manages the bank account, but members get suspicious when the money all but disappears.
But you knew there was a big chunk of money in there.
Yes, there should have been over $20,000 in there. Absolutely.
Any idea of how it was drained like that?
Nobody knew it was missing until we were told it's missing.
The league brings in a private investigator to look into where the money's gone.
And I talked to the board and I explained to them, you don't have anything but $31 in a frozen bank account. There's no records of anything as to where this money went, all spent.
There was an audit that was done. There were purchases made that weren't approved by the league.
There was purchases, the TJ Maxx purchases, the Olive Garden, and then when I started adding it up, I'm like, $32,000 in one night you raise for 2 sports teams, and it all just disappears. I mean, there's no way to rectify that.
Questions are now swirling over the missing money and if Natalie could be involved. And when some investors with the Cochran's business get wind of it, they're getting concerned about the money they've been promised.
As time is going on and you're not hearing anything, are you starting to panic at all?
We'd ask. We'd say, Natalie, we need our money. I said, our car's going to break down. We need the money back. She would say, it's coming, I promise. And then she would send me text messages and say, your money is going to be deposited in your bank account within the next 24 hours. And we'd wait. And it was never there.
You didn't get anything?
No.
Donna says that any communication she had about the couple's business was typically with Natalie, not her son.
Every time that I received any kind of a message, it was a text message from Natalie. It was she and I that was constantly going back and forth with contracts.
Meantime, Natalie continues to portray the business as extremely successful.
From the outside looking in, I would have probably been pretty impressed. Thought, man, right here in Raleigh County, West Virginia, these people are knocking it out of the park.
One investor says it's astonishing how much money Natalie says she's pulling in.
She did give me a number at the time. This was like $343 million we're going to have to put in this bank. That was a little hard to believe.
Natalie and Michael tell a local bank their business is worth more than $500 million when they apply for a $100,000 loan.
Was her business worth $500 million? No, absolutely not.
It turns out that Cochran's business is not what it appears to be.
I said, in pure West Virginian, this ain't good. I really felt in my heart something was going on.
The fundamental problem is that it was all a lie.
And when secrets come to light, it's far worse than anyone could have imagined.
There is nothing wrong with doing well and having a successful business.
The Cochrans and their business, Tactical Solutions Group, put themselves out to be legitimate government contractors who were bidding on legitimate government contracts.
She always made all of them look like they were good investments.
The problem is there never was any legitimate income flowing from government contracts. All the money and cash flow is coming from investors.
There were no contracts. There were never any contracts. There were never any bids. It doesn't exist.
The businesses didn't exist at all, really, legitimately.
They existed on paper.
It was clear that it was a Ponzi scheme.
When
When it comes to a Ponzi scheme, there's no real business. There's no money being generated. Early investors get paid by new investor money, like shifting poker chips from one pile to another. And as long as the money's coming in from new investors, the Ponzi scheme can continue.
If you're just taking one investor's money and giving it to another investor as if it's a legitimate return on their investment, that's a fraud.
I said, no, these are friends of mine. I've seen what they've done in the community.
Successful Ponzi schemes almost always rely on trust, and you often find that people start very close to home.
The Cochran business model seemed to be built on defrauding their friends and family. Many of them knew them their entire lives, and they had no reason to not trust them.
It would hurt a lot less for this to have been someone that I didn't know that had scammed me out of money. It would hurt a lot less. I was already wounded from my husband passing away, and my kids the same.
These were friends, neighbors, and family members who were defrauded, and the question is whether Michael knew about it.
Michael was not the brains of the couple. He was a great guy, but Natalie was the brains of the operation, and Michael would look for contracts on the government website, and then he would give them to Natalie, and she would make the bid.
Had Michael expressed any concerns, any doubts about the business? You?
Not about the business. He was stressed about the government. He did not understand why the government will not give them their money, and he just couldn't figure it out. How can they do this?
But of course, the federal government didn't owe the Cochrans any money because they'd never conducted any business with them.
Michael Cochran was asking her questions, very similar to the questions being asked by the investors who were trying to get their money back.
She was giving the same excuses to Michael that she was giving to the investors.
Natalie would tell me, and we're being audited. There's a government shutdown. There was always some excuse with her.
The lives and paychecks of some 800,000 federal workers hanging in the balance.
Around Christmas time in 2018, there was a government shutdown, and it lasted until January 25th of the following year.
Day 32 of the government shutdown, now beginning its second month. We have never seen this.
Natalie used this whole government shutdown to her advantage. Her investors were coming and saying, we want our money. We'd like to pull it out. And she would say, well, I can't. The government is shut down. There's no way to get access to your money. They're not paying anybody.
She had a never-ending list of reasons that they were not seeing their returns. When she could no longer blame the federal government for the delays, she turned to, I guess, more of the emotional side of, saying that she had cancer.
We're feeling bad for her. She even told us that she had cancer. She wasn't going to do anything about it. She was going to let God take care of it. And if he took her on, then that would be fine. And I just got so distraught and emotional, and I kept telling her she needed to fight, not to give up.
She said she was in stage 3. Her and Mike were talking about not going through chemo and radiation and just living what life she has left.
Was that devastating?
Oh, completely.
We were all pretty devastated. To the point, we all get the paperwork to go get our bone marrow tested to see if there was any way we could help her.
Remember, Toni McCall had lost her husband to leukemia. She was skeptical about Natalie's claim of having cancer.
I believe that Natalie used the leukemia to stall on having any payments. I knew she didn't have stage 3 leukemia because it's not in stages, it's in types. Everything pointed to the fact that she did not have it. She had told us that she was losing her hair from the chemo she was taking, and she flips her hair over, and she has a perfect dime-sized circle where she has shaved a spot in her hair. And if you lose your hair from chemo, you don't see 5 o'clock shadow. What woman would shave a spot on their head to say, look, I'm losing my hair? And so I absolutely knew at that point that she would do anything to cover up and to lie.
Then early one morning, Michael and Natalie are set to take a private plane to Virginia for a scheduled bank meeting. But they never make that flight.
I just kept asking her, what happened? What happened?
On the morning of February 6th, the plan was that the Cochrans, Michael and Natalie, were going to fly to Virginia to visit the Bank of America there.
She had text messages going with me and Jennifer.
So the morning of February 6th, they were going to go take a flight.
She said she was too sick to fly. She had the flu and the norovirus, and it hit her so hard because of her cancer. She had gone to the doctor, and they put her on such a high dose of steroids that her blood sugar was elevated. She had asked to borrow a vial of insulin.
So she needed a bottle of your son's insulin?
Yes. And I told her that Chris was getting ready to leave the house, that he could drop it off.
Chris drops the insulin around 10:30 that morning. Jennifer and Chris receive a photo about 2 hours later, around 12:30, of Michael laying unconscious in the Cochran's kitchen floor.
Michael was laying in the fetal position in the floor in his kitchen.
So she sends a photo out of him on the floor?
Yeah. And my reaction in the text was, is he okay? What's going on? He's fine. The contractors are here, put him on the couch. Okay.
Michael is moved from the floor to the couch. People start coming into the home saying, hey, you should probably take him to the hospital.
Throughout the day, some of the couple's friends come to the house while others text Natalie, worried about Michael.
Every time we would check on him, we would get, he's fine.
He's going to sleep it
He's
off.
going to be sleeping it off.
She said that he was sleeping it off on the couch.
The wording of the messages were as if she was communicating with him. He won't go to the hospital. Oh.
He won't go to the hospital?
Yes, but she says he won't go to the hospital. In my mind, I'm thinking that he's told her, I'm going to go to the hospital.
Almost unilaterally, all of Natalie's friends were urging her to take Michael to the hospital, and Michael needed medical attention.
So you're looking at close to 8 hours that this man, that he was incapacitated. He was unconscious. He was on the couch and pretty much unresponsive.
I get a message at around 6:30. I'm at Gavin's basketball game. And the message says, can you come by after the game?
Chris Davis shows up and insists that they take Michael to the hospital, and they load Michael in the car.
I knew something was wrong. He's just totally unresponsive. I was like, well, I said, he's got to go to the hospital.
He's been unconscious for 7-8 hours. Like, we're getting him to the hospital.
Michael got to the ER at Raleigh General Hospital. His blood glucose was at 21. He was critical, and he was intubated.
A blood glucose level of 21 would be extremely low, dangerously low, and basically result likely in some sort of massive cognitive dysfunction, coma, seizure, or even death.
Michael's parents are at home that night with no idea of their son's condition.
We came home from church, watched a little TV. I was in the bed. Eddie brought me my phone. He said, you got a text message from Natalie. It's 10:30 at night.
Concerned by such a late-night text, Michael's mom, Donna, checks Natalie's message.
She sent me a picture. There's Michael Brandon in the bed, and he's on the ventilator, unconscious, unresponsive.
The Davises also received texts from Natalie showing Michael in the hospital.
I just kept asking her on text message, what happened? What happened?
Doctors determined that Michael is suffering from cerebral edema.
Cerebral edema is the medical term for swelling in the brain. We usually think about cerebral edema in the setting of a bleed or a traumatic event.
Michael Brandon, he was fighting to breathe. He was trying his best to live.
Michael spends at least 4.5 days in a hospital in Charleston.
She makes this decision. She's going to take him off the ventilator and everything.
What are you thinking at that point, Jennifer?
I think there's total shock. I just remember thinking, this isn't happening. This can't be real.
Yeah.
So tragic.
What is this weird nightmare that just, my goodness.
That's visited upon this couple.
Yeah.
She's sick and now he's dying.
Like, those poor kids. My goodness. Those poor, this is awful. It was awful.
for 5 days. He received medical treatment. He was in a coma, never regained consciousness, and passed away on February the 11th at the hospice house in Beckley.
Your friend, 38 years old, within days, is gone.
It was awful. It was tragic.
It's just sad, you know. We went to the funeral. It just all seems surreal. Everything's just kind of like you're like in this fog, you know. Just unimaginable.
After Mike had passed, Lee called me one day and said that I've created this scholarship in his memory.
Natalie starts a scholarship called the Coach Michael Cochran Legacy Scholarship. It appeared that Natalie was selecting people who were family members. There were also people that Michael coached.
Tony McCall's son is one of those high school students that Natalie had offered a 4-year college scholarship to.
These scholarships, they're the kind that kids dream of.
Natalie, newly widowed, continues running her businesses, but then 4 months after her husband's death, she suddenly decides to sell nearly half of Tactical Solutions Group for $4 million.
She had negotiated to sell that business with a buyer, offering to buy a 49% interest of her business. So this buyer had wired her $50,000 as an earnest deposit on his buy-in to this business.
But before the deal can go through, police show up at the Cochran home with a search warrant.
She said, they came here and they took everything. When they raided her house that day in June, that was huge. I mean, it was all anyone could talk about.
When police search the Cochran home, they find something unexpected that could explain Michael's sudden death.
A man, 38 years old, what a fitness guru he was, to suddenly die in the midst of financial crimes occurring. I mean, that's pretty suspicious.
So they decide to exhume Michael Cochran's body. Does the big con turn into an even bigger crime?
At first, this was just a Ponzi scheme investigation.
Tonight, all eyes on the headline-making court case that just wrapped.
The interest in this case was huge.
Police are investigating the death of Michael Cochran.
To suddenly die in the midst of allegations of financial crimes was pretty suspicious.
So you think he was duped as well?
100% I believe that.
The defense counsel made it clear they were living this lavish lifestyle. So how couldn't he have known that this was a Ponzi scheme?
Natalie weaved such a web of lies, keeping us all drinking the Kool-Aid.
They open the fridge, they find the vial of insulin.
That was huge.
Did anybody take insulin in the house?
No. I said, insulin? What are you doing with the insulin in the refrigerator?
Prosecutors called that the murder weapon.
What keeps Gavin alive, she used to take life.
Just in shock. I'm still in shock.
The defense can say, maybe he died of something else.
I know that he took steroids and he took many other supplements.
He was a ticking bomb.
Your daughter-in-law is being accused of killing your son.
I mean, how do you kill somebody that you're supposed to love?
It's been 7 months since 38-year-old Michael Cochran's death, and Private Eye James Quisenberry sends an employee on an undercover mission to Michael's wife Natalie's garage.
I just seen the sign and figured I'd come out this way.
Oh.
She was selling a bunch of things and items at her house.
This is security camera cable, and then this is Ethernet cable.
He's there to secretly get a closer look.
The question was still out there of whether she was sitting on a pile of money, all these different questions.
You don't want some of the rest of anything else?
Not really. I don't keep things for my son. My husband passed away, so my dad helped me go through it, and we kept things that my son might need when he grows up.
Okay. Had there been something there that shouldn't have been there, would have turned it over to law enforcement. She's all smiles and looking at him and trying to be polite, and as soon as he turns his back, she changes her look, like her whole demeanor changes.
In the months since Michael Cochran's death, authorities have started to take a hard look at the Cochrans' so-called businesses.
I received a phone call from a trooper who had spoke with a local business person who had purchased some firearms from the Cochrans, and he had a problem with getting his firearms delivered or the money returned, and he was looking for help in resolving that matter. He had been solicited to be an investor in contracts. He never did it because the information he was receiving from Natalie Cochran on these investment solicitations didn't make sense to him.
I was like, yes, we definitely need to take a look at this.
So that disgruntled customer and connected investigators with someone who said he had invested with Natalie Cochran.
The problem that he was encountering was he kept getting excuse after excuse after excuse with getting his money returned.
Bob was going through the records as they were coming in, and so there's a ton of information there to go through. And Bob's looking at it. We're sitting there one day, and he goes, "I'll be damned." He said, "It's a damn Ponzi scheme."
As they dig in, they take notice of the investigation into that Little League account. Remember, board members had been suspicious of Natalie after money had gone missing.
The Shady Spring Little League bank account is one of the many accounts she used to facilitate her Ponzi scheme.
Natalie would deposit from their company and then sift it back out in various different ways.
Natalie called the alleged financial crimes bogus, and ultimately authorities decided not to charge her with anything related to the Little League.
The league never recouped any money. It was all just lost.
It's late into the summer, and those generous Michael Cochran legacy scholarships which Natalie had promised students are now supposed to be paid out.
There were 8 people in total. They are full-ride scholarships for up to 8 years.
Tony McCall's son was given one of those college scholarships.
There was no money. It was a fake scholarship. Natalie weaved such a web of lies. They were bizarre like that. It was still keeping us all in the flock.
Natalie Cochran has insisted the scholarships would have been paid if her assets hadn't eventually been frozen by the government, but investigators had a different view.
When she created these, we saw that as an attempt to dispel rumors. Rumors were circulating that her business was being looked at, that she didn't have this wealth or this money.
We had pretty clearly identified at least, and I may be under at least 10 known victims of the Ponzi scheme.
The most obvious red flag at the time was that nobody was getting any money back.
We had more than enough evidence and documentation to proceed with indictment.
So she's arrested.
Yes.
What did you think of that?
We were glad. When she was arrested, she was wearing the Tailgate Socialite t-shirt. That was the true Natalie right there.
Natalie Cochran faces 26 charges related to the fraud. She pleads not guilty. Her investors are deeply distraught over the hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost money.
I spent $256,000.
$511,000.
Almost $250,000 over the course of 2.5 years. We loved her. We believed her. Everything she told us, we believed everything she said to us.
Chris Davis says he too was taken in by his trust in Natalie and by the impressive paperwork she supplied.
It looks legitimate. I mean, there are a lot of companies and there are a lot of entities here. Why would she do this?
I don't know if it was the greed or the position or status.
Reaching a deal with prosecutors, Natalie pled guilty to 2 counts, an unlawful monetary transaction and wire fraud.
And then she went off to prison for 11 years for fraud.
She did. May 1st of 2021 is when she finally went into the prison at Hazleton.
The court also ordered her to pay back $2.5 million to the investors she fleeced. But with income coming in, it will likely be a very long process.
Did you feel that was fair, that was right?
The judge said, if I could give you more, I would. He acknowledged the fact that the lawyers had reached this plea agreement and it capped what he could have done to her. So no, at that moment, I didn't believe it was fair. And just as I told the judge, there's 2.5 million reasons why it wasn't fair.
But this isn't over yet. A search warrant in the fraud case had led investigators into the Cochran home and brought an unexpected surprise.
They opened the fridge. They find the vial of insulin. It's suspicious that it shouldn't be there. Nobody in the family is diabetic.
Does that insulin have anything to do with Michael Cochran's death? We'll hear from his wife Natalie for the first time as investigators hit her with some tough questions.
We'll be having a conversation with Natalie Cochran.
This investigation is just getting started.
At first, this was just a Ponzi scheme investigation.
But as authorities investigate the fraud case, they also begin questioning Michael Cochran's unexpected death.
Michael Cochran, who was 38 years old, seemingly a fit, healthy man, he took care of himself. He did worked out all the time. To suddenly die in the midst of allegations of financial crimes, that's pretty suspicious.
No autopsy had been done on Michael Cochran. The death certificate issued by the hospice where he died listed natural causes.
There was no medical examiner involvement.
Natalie Cochran gave different versions of what happened with Michael on February the 6th to multiple people.
So authorities arrange a meeting with Natalie.
Today's date is April 8th, 2019. I explained to her we were looking into Michael's death. Natalie, just tell me how things progressed with Michael.
February the 6th, whatever David was in the hospital. And he was thinking all of a sudden he started throwing up in the sink. And I heard him hit his head and I went in there and did cough. And so I didn't know what to do because Michael was very adamant after we got out of the hospital last time. So if you ever take him to the hospital again, you're going to be dead.
It turns out Michael had been hospitalized for several days back in November for potential exposure to black mold. Natalie says she thought one of his training supplements could have been making him sick.
It was her belief that Michael had taken an overdose of this supplement that she alleged was coming from Mexico.
I'd always been arguing like this stuff's not safe. It even came in a bottle that said for animal use only, not for human ingestion. It's like they're taking it to gain mass and got cut up.
Gotcha.
And I also had an insulin component in it, but bodybuilders can manipulate insulin to cut muscle.
She introduces insulin in the discussion as part of Michael Cochran's weightlifting regimen.
Mike was all about, he was just very into body.
Is there any chance that he would have purposely taken too much of that?
He did purposely take too much, but he was trying to super load.
There was always this effort to make sure that there was an explanation for insulin being somehow involved in Michael's death. In the third conversation, she brought up that Michael was injecting with insulin. She had done a complete pivot from where it was all this supplement. Now Michael's injecting insulin. The insulin he was doing through injection.
Correct. He would inject it before meals so that it would cover any carbs that he ate.
Insulin is used primarily by diabetics to essentially help us regulate the blood sugar in our body.
He wasn't diabetic, obviously.
No.
And remember, the fraud investigation is still ongoing. In June of 2019, federal and state authorities conduct a search of the Cochran house.
Natalie is there.
She was in the garage. The search warrant was done based off the financial crime information investigation only.
Anticipated finding additional evidence regarding this Ponzi scheme.
But they found something else they didn't expect.
Sometimes things happen in investigations that you call it fate. I started rummaging through the refrigerator, and there's this bottle of insulin sitting right there.
It shouldn't be there. Nobody in the family is diabetic.
That was huge. Where did it come from? Whose is it?
Natalie's got the same answer for authorities and for Michael's mother.
She said, oh, they came here and they took everything. And she said they even took the insulin out of the refrigerator.
Now, what did you make of that? Did anybody take insulin in the house?
No. I said, insulin? What are you doing with the insulin in the refrigerator? I keep that here, she said, for Gavin when he came over if he needed a shock, because he's a diabetic.
You believed it?
We did.
Remember, Gavin is Chris and Jennifer Davis's son. They tell authorities they never stored his insulin at the Cochran house. But then they recall the bag they left for Natalie the morning Michael collapsed.
Investigators said did she ever borrow insulin from you? And that's when Jennifer's like, yeah, she needed it. She had cancer and she got sick. And that's when they were like, you know when? And I felt like at that moment, we both were like, oh my goodness. Because now we know that she's a thief and a fraud.
When we started seeing the text messages with Jennifer Davis about insulin, it was very revealing. If you believe the previous things that Natalie has said, she should have already had the insulin readily available in the home. So it made no sense to go through all this effort. I think it's clear that she poisoned him with insulin.
Authorities develop a theory of how Natalie may have used insulin to kill Michael.
When he's finally taken to the emergency room, he presented with a blood sugar level of 21. And he's not diabetic.
You get low blood sugar by receiving too much insulin. Natalie had access to insulin. She had the means to inject it. She knew exactly what insulin would do.
Investigators believe there's enough circumstantial evidence to tie Natalie to Michael's death.
39-year-old Natalie Cochran is now accused of the February 2019 murder of her husband, Michael.
Natalie Cochran pleads not guilty.
Is that hard for you to accept that your daughter-in-law is being accused of killing your son?
Yeah, it was really hard to believe because, I mean, how do you kill somebody that you're supposed to love and they're your children's father?
But why would Natalie want to kill her husband?
The investigators thought the text messages looked suspicious.
Michael didn't know about the Ponzi scheme, but he was learning.
Michael was about to discover he didn't have millions, perhaps $1 billion of legitimately earned income inbound from the federal government. And that was a problem for Natalie.
Here is exactly the motive of why she felt like she had to kill Michael.
Opening arguments began today in the Natalie Cochran trial.
In January, more than 3 years after she was indicted for the first-degree murder of her husband Michael, Natalie Cochran's trial is finally underway.
There were media outlets from all over the country here. The interest in this case was huge.
You may be seated.
For Michael's family and friends, the 3-year wait for justice has been agonizing.
How tough was that for you all to just have this thing drag on before it's going to be resolved?
It was hard.
Yes, very hard.
Spent lots of time praying.
What was it like for you to see Natalie in that courtroom?
I can't say that I really even thought about her. We just had to get justice for Michael.
Natalie Cochran is a young woman. An 11-year sentence with good time served for the Ponzi scheme is relatively short versus a life sentence for murder. Those stakes are incredibly high.
All right, now, Mr. Goodman, you may proceed.
Thank you. On February the 5th of 2019, Michael Cochran was a 200-pound, healthy 38-year-old man. By midday of February 6th of 2019, he had lost consciousness, and he would never regain consciousness.
The state needs to get ahead of the fact that it's an entirely circumstantial case. You got to tell the jury, you're not going to get the stuff you get on TV. There's no DNA, there's no fingerprints. This is it. But that's enough to convict.
This is a complex case, ladies and gentlemen. But it's built by the state of West Virginia on conjectures and innuendos, and glaringly lacking in motive and the evidence necessary to prove my client killed her husband. Natalie understood that we cannot present a defense that would somehow skirt the issue of the Ponzi scheme or that would hide it from the jury. We admitted to the jury what was well known to everybody. The fact that she is perhaps a fraud and perhaps a cheat, and that you wouldn't perhaps want to invite her home for Sunday dinner, that you wouldn't like her, does not translate into being a murderer.
We absolutely believe that the imminent failure of the Ponzi scheme was Natalie's motive to kill Michael. That was going to happen, and it was going to happen very, very quickly if she didn't act.
What Michael Cochran didn't know is certainly one of the most important questions here. But to me, what's more important is what he was about to know, the consequences that would come when he found out that information.
And at the heart of the case, a vial of insulin.
Prosecutors called that the weapon.
Yeah. What keeps Gavin alive, she used to kill. She used to take life.
On the morning of February 6th, Jennifer Davis remembers getting a text from Natalie asking to borrow that insulin. She testifies about that exchange.
Can you just explain to me what's going on in this conversation? She said that her and Mike, they were both sick, and she had to start taking small insulin shots. Did you provide that insulin to her?
I put the insulin in a bag and gave it to my husband, and he dropped it off on the porch on the way to work.
Several hours later, Natalie sends Jennifer a picture of Michael unconscious on the kitchen floor.
What did this picture mean to you when you received it?
Just that it was just shocking that he was laying there.
Natalie contacts 2 construction workers that had worked for the family, says, Michael's on the floor. I'm going to need help picking him up from the floor and taking him into the living room.
So after Chris Davis drops off the bag of insulin, Natalie sends out a text. She invites several friends over throughout the day to check on his condition and essentially make sure he's okay, but not take him to the hospital.
In a statement to ABC News, Natalie Cochran says that, quote, Mike hated the hospital. He threatened several people that we'd better not take him back.
Stephanie Hamilton, a physician's assistant, came over to check Michael out and found him non-responsive.
What did you specifically ask?
That he needed to be checked. I said even people with the history of seizures, anytime they have one, they need to be checked. I kept offering, like, I would go with her. She said she was going to let him sleep it off.
You also heard from her later that. Take a look at that. 21. What does that mean?
One should ever have a blood sugar of 21.
What's going to happen if they do?
They're in a coma. Probably near death.
At some point, you go over.
Yes, and I walk in the living room. He's laying on the couch, like he's sleeping.
What did you do?
So I go over to him. I just remember saying, man, hey buddy, I'm going to take you to the hospital. And that's exactly what I did.
But by this time, it's too late. Michael gets to the hospital, but the damage has been done.
Take a moment, you're okay.
Chris, it was very tough for you in court when they showed you the photo that you had already seen of Mike.
Yeah.
Why did it hit you so hard?
I wished I could have got to him first.
Over 2 days, prosecutors have meticulously laid out the timeline of the day Michael Cochran died. The question now, will they be able to prove that it was his wife Natalie who killed him?
Mr. Truman, you may call your first witness.
As prosecutors lay out their case against Natalie Cochran, they intend to show that she not only had the means, but the motive and the opportunity to kill her husband Michael back in February of 2019.
Thank you, Your Honor. The state calls Robert Heinzman.
Raise your right hand, please, sir.
Bob Heinzman was the primary investigator of the defendant's Ponzi scheme, and he explained there was really no evidence that Michael knew what was going on.
Now, the defense has floated the theory that Michael Cochran was up to his eyeballs in this Ponzi scheme. From your investigation, do you have any evidence that would support that?
He believed that they had obtained contracts and that they would be receiving money for these contracts.
Do you have any evidence that he knew that this was a fraud being carried on?
No.
It was important to hammer home that Michael Cochran was at least cognizant of the scheme, because it would destroy the state's theory of why it happened. Have you, in your thorough investigation of this case, talked to the children of Mr. and Mrs. Cochran?
No.
Would it surprise you if I told you that they observed
their parents work on the federal contracts, and you're telling this jury that he had no knowledge of these contracts?
I'm not telling the jury that. I said that he knew about the contracts that he was led to believe were bid on by their business.
The investigation had revealed Michael was beginning to ask some really tough questions of Natalie about where the money was going.
The day before, February 5th of 2019, it was arranged by the Cochrans to charter a flight from Beckley down to Lynchburg, Virginia to meet with the Bank of America banker. And of course, that was a meeting that Natalie could never allow to happen, because if it did happen, then Michael would know, and that would have been the end of her Ponzi scheme.
Court Nexon was an employee of Bank of America. He testified via Zoom in this trial because he's not local.
And that was to take place February 6th of 2019, correct?
Correct. Looks like they said they were going to fly in, and so we were basically responding to their schedule and setting things up as best as we could.
Did that meeting take place?
Never took place.
Natalie was becoming desperate at this point.
Prosecutors argue that if Michael was in the dark, Natalie's deception was about to come to light.
Putting Jennifer Davis on the stand explains how Natalie got the insulin that she needed to kill Michael. Jennifer, at this point, you were offering to help out a friend in need. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Did she accept your offer of help?
Yes, she did. She asked if she could borrow a vial of insulin.
According to Dr. Uribe, who was one of our forensic pathologists, the only way that Michael's blood sugar could have plummeted to 21 was if someone else had given him insulin.
There was profound hypoglycemia. Hypoglycemia is low blood glucose. Once he was treated for the hypoglycemia, the blood sugar went up and then it went back down again. To me, that is a significant pattern.
And why is that pattern significant to you?
Because there are only a few things that can do that. One of the big things is insulin administration.
But the defense poses an important question. Could Michael have injected himself as part of a bodybuilding regimen? Dr. Uribe pushes back against that suggestion.
To my knowledge, bodybuilders don't use insulin.
During the murder investigation, Michael's remains were exhumed, and Dr. Uribe conducted an autopsy.
And what did you determine were Michael Cochran's cause and manner of death?
I came to the conclusion that the cause of death was exogenous insulin administration.
Your Honor, the state calls Timothy Bledsoe to the stand. Tim was able to draw all of the parallels and connect all of the pieces. He was able to explain for the jury how and why the Ponzi scheme and the failure of the Ponzi scheme led to the murder of Michael Cochran.
It was about telling that story, another piece to the puzzle. And I think overall, we were successful.
And we previously heard Jennifer Davis testify that she had insulin sent to the defendant's home. Is that your understanding?
Yes.
Do you recall why the defendant needed the insulin that morning?
I believe it was something related to cancer treatment.
And throughout the entire course of your investigation, did you ever uncover any evidence that the defendant had cancer?
No.
Did you waver at all? Did you wonder maybe the prosecutor got this wrong, that it was just a horrible set of circumstances?
Not once they talked to us. And then I started going back through, my text, and, Chris and I started talking, and then I was just in shock, disbelief. I'm still in shock. It just doesn't seem real at all. But it was hard.
Prosecutors have rested their case. Now it's the defense's turn to persuade the jury that Natalie Cochran is innocent. And to do that, they bring in their own star witnesses, Michael and Natalie's children.
You swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Yes, sir.
The state has wrapped its case of circumstantial evidence. Now it's the defense's turn.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the jury.
Good morning.
They believe there's not enough evidence to prove that Natalie Cochran killed her husband, Michael.
The atmosphere in the courtroom was, what's the defense going to bring? You could sense some anxiety there of what the defense was going to say about Michael to try and explain away Natalie's actions.
The defense has already told the jury that Michael Cochran was, quote, a ticking bomb because of his alleged medical problems and health history. Their game plan is to discredit the prosecution's case and Michael Cochran himself.
There was no forensic evidence to tie her to a murder. Zero forensic evidence.
They called two surprising witnesses to the stand, Natalie and Michael's children.
Would you state your name for the record?
Nicole Cochran.
What type of medication was he taking?
I know that he took steroids and he took many other supplements.
Did he do it daily?
Yes, every morning.
Was he into supplements and vitamins and all of that stuff?
Oh, absolutely. He took his supplements, his pre-workouts, and those things. He tried to take care of his body.
He would lay all of his pills out on the counter, and there would be so many of them that they would just sit in a whole circle and it looked like the size of a dinner plate. And then he would scoop them handfuls at a time into his mouth.
The theory by the defense counsel is that Michael Cochran was not a healthy individual.
Did you start noticing changes in your father's health?
He was very agitated and angry, more so than not, and he was having a lot of headaches.
The defense asked the same line of questioning to the Cochran's son, whose face is concealed on the witness stand because he's a minor.
Did he ever inject anything?
Definitely steroids.
He took supplements and things like that. Did he take steroids?
He never took any steroids. If you would see him, everything that he has, all the muscles he has, is natural. Hard work.
Mike wasn't a bodybuilder. He ate too much pizza to be a bodybuilder. Was he fit? He was. Was he in shape? He was. Did he work hard for that? He did.
He was taking things from Mexico, they were saying. Things that were not approved by the FDA.
What did he get from Mexico, do you know?
I don't know the name of the steroid, but it was definitely an anabolic.
What was that like to see them testifying on their mother's behalf?
You know, they love their mother. Of course, they're going to defend their mother. But the things they said about their father was really heartbreaking.
Defense lawyers argue that Michael Cochran was not exactly a healthy 38-year-old, and that his lifestyle led to 4 hospital visits between 2017 and the time of his death in 2019.
He got sick, and I feel like around that time is when you could just notice that he started to change a little bit, just forgetting stuff all the time, and he was more aggressive.
Towards whom? Aggressive?
Towards everybody.
Natalie had told friends and family that her husband also suffered from seizures, plus symptoms of black mold poisoning from renovations he did on their house. Oh, had you heard of him having seizures?
We were told that he had seizures, and he was exposed to black mold.
The defense also tries to hammer away at the state's motive, the Ponzi scheme. They claim Natalie Cochran wasn't the only one involved. They say Michael was, too.
I always saw him working on his computer, and he would say that that's what he was doing.
Say that he was doing what?
That he was filling out contracts.
Did your mother do that?
No.
Who was working on the contracts?
My dad.
We had heard that Natalie Cochran was going to take the stand. She had informed the judge that she was going to testify in her own behalf. And at the last minute, she decided that she wasn't going to testify.
The jury was extremely attentive, but the jury was never more invested in what was being said than in the closing arguments.
All right, are you folks ready to deliver your closing remarks?
Natalie was a diabetic counselor and a pharmacist. She knew that injecting insulin into a non-diabetic would cause harm.
Is that the action? A planning cold-blooded killer? She would get that insulin ahead of time. Not on the day of the murder, and involve 2 witnesses against her right there and then.
She chose over and over, after repeated pleas from friends and loved ones, to leave Michael on the couch.
It's a horrible tragedy, but a tragedy, not a murder.
The state failed to answer a couple of questions, and that is, when did it happen? Where did it happen? How did it happen?
There was no deductive reasoning where you would say, well, it was Professor Plum with the candlestick in the study.
Well, it was actually the pharmacist in the kitchen, according to the prosecution's theory.
She had a clear motive, and you saw that leading up to this date, Michael was about to find out what she was doing to people. Do we know what he was going to do with that information? We never will, because he won't have the chance to tell us.
Miss Cochran is committed crimes of fraud, but that doesn't make her a murderer. We're asking you to find her not guilty.
21 was such a crucial number because nobody's blood glucose should be at that level unless you've had an injection of insulin.
A normal blood glucose level would be anywhere from 70 to around 130.
21. And that's the number we're going to rely on to convince you beyond a reasonable doubt that this defendant killed Michael Cochran. Find this defendant guilty of first-degree murder because that's exactly what she did.
The case is now in the hands of the jury. Were prosecutors able to convince them that Natalie Cochran killed her husband? Or did the defense poke enough holes to sow reasonable doubt?
People yell out, "There's a verdict," and then people start scurrying to get a seat inside the courtroom.
Has the jury reached a verdict?
When that verdict comes back, they were shocked.
The verdict, handed down just weeks ago, came quickly. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours.
Would the defendant please rise? The jury verdict is as follows. The defendant is guilty of murder in the first degree.
What was it like when you heard guilty?
We were so happy because we're finally getting justice for Michael after all these years.
You know, I could just feel my spirit and everything just went, you know, this is what it's supposed to be.
It was exhilarating to hear the word guilty. And all I can think is we did it. We got her.
And the jury is not finished. They've got another decision to make, what's known as the mercy phase.
Good morning, members of the jury. You are back.
Mercy, which means the defendant gets parole eligibility after serving 15 years, or no mercy, which means there's no eligibility for parole.
You'll raise your right hand, please.
A slew of Natalie Cochran's family, including her mom, tearfully take the stand.
I beg. I don't know what else I can say except please give mercy to her.
For a second time, Natalie's 19-year-old daughter faces the jury that's already convicted her mom in her father's murder.
I missed her at my high school graduation, and I missed her on the day I moved into college. I'm begging you to give her mercy so that I don't have to miss more.
Natalie Cochran's family ended up leaving when the family of Michael Cochran, when they were up there.
Raise your right hand, please, ma'am.
We, along with our family and friends, have sat quietly and graciously and painfully watched and listened as Michael's good name has been murdered time and time again.
It was one of the most intense pieces of testimony in the entire trial.
This spoiled, evil, narcissistic murderer had seldom, if ever, been denied this which she wanted. She will try to blame my precious son Michael for her evilness and deceit.
Do you remember what you said that you felt the strongest about?
When I said that, please, don't give her any mercy. We ask that you please, no mercy. She never gave Michael any mercy.
I think it was extremely riveting for the jury to see.
We, the jury, unanimously do not recommend mercy.
Natalie Cochran will spend the rest of her life in prison.
But the pain lives on for Michael's friends, Jennifer and Chris, whose son's insulin may very well have been used to end their friend's life.
I trusted her, and that's the exact same thing she used. And borrowed from me. And that's hard. And that's something I'll have to live with.
As far as I'm concerned, justice has been done. She's where she needs to be.
You've lost your son. You've lost financially. You've lost a lot.
Yes, we have. But we have each other, and we're strong for each other. That's the only way we can get by. And because of God,
What about your grandchildren? Do you hope to have a relationship at some point with them?
Right now, I think it's best the way that it is. I don't see them coming around. And we have to accept it and just go on.
Just days after the verdict, I visited with Michael's parents. His stepfather, Ed, took me to a special place they'd created to honor their son's memory. This is your memorial to Michael.
Yeah, not able to get up there to his gravesite tonight. So I said, well, keep it, right here close. Anytime we want to go, we can just come up here.
What do you think about when you come out here and sit on that bench?
Madonna and I, sometimes we kind of sit around down here. There'll be like a butterfly that'll come around. And I told Donna, I said, there's little Michael. So we've got a little cutout flower over there that he's always down here.
Such an emotional story to report on, David. Those heartbroken parents placing a memorial bench where they can always remember their son, Michael.
We should note tonight that Natalie Cochran does plan to appeal her murder conviction. In the meantime, that is our program for tonight. I'm David Muir.
And I'm Deborah Roberts. From all of us here at 2020 and ABC News, good night.
The building that's on fire.
Yeah.
It is okay then.
I got out. I managed to get out.
Right then. It's okay. Is everybody out of the building?
No, there's still my partner in.
Right. Is he able to get out of the building?
No, because there's fires near the door.
When the call came in, it seemed an unlikely town and an unlikely venue for this sort of thing to happen. At a joinery shop, after tea, when you wouldn't expect people to be working, things just didn't seem quite right.
Everybody was really quite worried. It could have been the person who walked past in the street, it could have been anybody.
I don't know how anybody could live with it, knowing that they burnt somebody alive.
Everybody was so shocked, and everybody was locking up more and feeling a bit worried about it all, because nothing like this had ever happened in the village.
A few miles from the bustling seaside resort of Skegness sits the small, picturesque market town of Borough-le-Marche, affectionately known by its residents as the Village.
Everybody here calls it a village because we feel like village people. We're so connected and so we help one another.
Borough-le-Marche is a typical Lincolnshire village on the edge of the Lincolnshire Wolds, famous for its windmill, where people are hard-working and just get on with their lives.
I've had a salon in Borough-le-Marche for 14, 15 years, and it's a lovely, quiet village where everybody knows everybody. Everybody gets on with everybody, and my clients are lovely.
But the peaceful tranquility of the village is about to go up in flames.
We've just gone up to the workshop to pick some things out.
Yeah.
And somebody came up with us behind.
Yeah.
And they attacked us and set fire to the place.
The workshop on fire belongs to well-known local couple David Twigg and Julie Dixon, who own a joinery business next to their home. As the emergency call comes in, Lincolnshire Fire and Rescue Station Commander Gary Milson is immediately dispatched to the scene.
Once I received the call, I'd be straight into my car and making headway down to Borough-le-Marche. It's only a few miles down the road. There's not a lot of time to mull over things and get other information in. The information that was relayed to me at that point was that two men dressed in black and wearing balaclavas had accosted David Twigg and his partner. They'd locked David into the storeroom and then proceeded to pour petrol into the foyer of the building and lit it before fleeing the scene. As I approached the premise, there was a white picket fence surrounding it. It seemed quite surreal, the appliances at the bottom with the lights on. As I walked past that towards the entrance where the activity was taking place, the incident commander gave me a quick brief and said that there was very little fire and the fire was out, and they was now trying to locate David Twigg, who they'd been informed was locked in a room inside the building.
With the blaze having been brought under control and extinguished, Gary and his team desperately tried to locate David Twigg.
The workshops were in old railway buildings. They were long and thin, and at the end there was a small area with a kitchen, a storeroom, and a toilet, and a small foyer that linked these all together. And they were all involved in the fire. They was all black and heated and sooty, but they were all empty apart from the storeroom door that was locked. There was no keys present. The decision was made that the wall might be easier to break through than the door, and a hole was made in the wall when we could see that there was somebody who appeared to be on the knees facing the door. We tried to rouse them through shouting and speaking to them, but there was no response.
With David not responding, the urgency to reach him grows and the fire crew break deeper into the wall, releasing the door.
As the door opened, David Twigg fell forward into our arms and forward onto the floor. The crews immediately turned him over and began resuscitation. We had an ambulance already in attendance, and the paramedics were very quickly there, and we assisted the paramedics in placing him into the ambulance where they could work on him further.
In the back of the ambulance, paramedics battle to resuscitate David Twigg.
The time frame from the call to us getting David out of the cupboard may have been around about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we worked on him for probably another 15-20 minutes after that before the paramedics decided to call time and pronounce him dead.
With David dead, the situation immediately changes. And a murder investigation is launched.
The first information I got was that there'd been a fire at a business premises near Skegness in Lincolnshire, of course, and that two men had been involved. They'd made off where they hadn't been found at the moment. A man had tragically died, believed to be the owner of the business, and his partner, who worked with him, a lady, had been quite badly injured in the incident. She was being taken to hospital to be treated, and officers were at the scene. There was lots of things going through your mind, but at no stage anything other than, this is a murder case. It's tragic that David Twigg has died, and we need to find these two people as soon as possible.
With fire crews, police and paramedics at the scene, it isn't long before news of the tragedy spreads around the town.
It was a big event for Lincolnshire. A robbery homicide in a small village like Borough Marsh is something that had never happened before in my 25 years covering the area, and it may well never happen again.
Rumours I heard was they was looking for two men, and my house faces a back field, and of course the drones was going over there. There was quite some noise, and I couldn't believe it actually.
The whole village were stunned that something could have happened on the doorsteps.
It was big news, and everybody was really quite worried that whoever did it could have been out there and they could have been next. You just don't know.
There was a lot of anxiety in the community. Borough Marsh is a long way from the nearest police station, a long way sometimes from the nearest police officer, and local people were obviously very concerned that they may be the victim of a similar burglary.
In the Lincolnshire town of Borough Marsh, police have launched a murder investigation after local joiner David Twigg was pronounced dead following a fire at his workshop. His partner, Julie Dixon, had managed to escape and call 999, reporting that masked intruders had broken in, locked David in the storeroom, and set the place on fire.
The impact on the local community after this happened was immense. That's the only way I can describe it. I was clearly getting phone calls. The local community officers were being stopped in the street. People were going to the police station. There was a kind of sense of not just why has this happened, but who's responsible, and just as importantly, is it going to happen again? Is somebody else going to be, the target of these two individuals? And nobody could think of a reason why David and Julie would be targeted.
David Twigg was an only son. He grew up in the area. His parents remained in the area. He was a master joiner, very popular and a hard-working man in the local area. He was also a very big man, well over 6 feet tall and 19 stone, but he was a presence in the community.
David met Julie in 1996 when she was going through a divorce. The pair quickly moved in together.
they remained together for 15 years. They came across as a typical middle-aged couple. In Borough-le-Marche, David and Julie were seen as a team. David was the carpenter, the joiner at the business, and Julie was doing the finance and the accounts for the business.
Outside of joinery, David soon discovered a new hobby, stock car racing, which opened up a whole new social circle for him and Julie, with professional racer John Mickle and his wife Lisa.
So from that very first race meeting, really kind of just kicked it off. We enjoyed each other's company. They wanted to come to every single race meeting. They wanted to be involved.
And David soon found a way to combine work with his newfound love when he set up a sideline alongside his joinery company.
As David's business grew, he was quite happy to sponsor the motor racing team. That was one of his passions, and so they undertook that deal, which was several £1,000s.
Julie and David were keen to promote this new kitchen bits and bobs business, which is an online business that they were trying to get off the ground. I think they felt that probably some branding on the race cars, and then obviously we can promote it through social media as well.
The sponsorship proved very successful. David particularly got on very well with the racing team, and they were invited over to America to watch the team racing, and all seemed well. It was a very happy relationship, and he got on very well with them.
I think from the beam on his face when we first, agreed at Liddon Hill, he just seemed incredibly proud. He seemed very smiley. You could tell he was passionate about his business, and this was something that he felt was going to enhance the people that would see his work.
The friendship between the two couples started to grow stronger.
I think from the very first time we met them, I really, really liked what they brought to the team and, the energy, and we call it a race family, and it just felt like they were going to become part of our race family. Julie wanted to be hands-on with me in the kitchen, while David was very quick to throw himself into the deep end with John on the mechanic side as well. Just got stuck in. It wasn't just about the racing anymore. They started to get quite involved. She wanted to be involved in the family life that we had as well. She would buy presents for my children, who were aged 4 and 7 then. They looked fondly upon her and David as well. So they became family friends.
And it was Lisa Julie turned to in the aftermath of the tragedy of David's death.
The very first time I heard about David was on Monday morning. I had a phone call somewhere between 7 and 7:30 in the morning from Julie. She basically was hysterical. She was shouting down the phone, "He's dead, he's dead." And I really didn't have a clue what she was even talking about. I didn't know who's dead. I said, "Julie, who's dead?" She said, David's dead. And I then tried to get some more information. What's happened? She said, a fire. So none of her sentences were very long. It was just words being thrown out at me. I said, a fire? What? There's a house fire? She said, no, workshop, fire, masked men, attacked. From that phone call, I immediately knew I had to go and visit her straight away. I knew it would be a long journey up to Lincolnshire, probably 4 hours. I just grabbed my purse, my keys, and left. So the 4 hours going there it's a weird and surreal situation. You keep thinking, has this really happened? Is this some kind of, is this true? Is it real? I just can't get my head around it. It's an awful lot of information. Hearing her so upset on the phone. And those words, "he's dead," they just kept playing and playing in my head.
When Lisa arrives at Julie's parents' house, she finds Julie in a state of shock.
Julie was sitting and rocking in a chair. I was absolutely taken back when I first saw her because she had burns on her face. She told me that her and David, on the Sunday, had gone down to the yard, which is just a short stroll from the house, to lock up. That's all they were doing. They were going to lock up. She said that she had asked David to go into the storeroom to get a light bulb. And these two men wearing balaclavas, dressed in black and hoodies, had come into the barn, had locked David in the cupboard, and then had grabbed her. and that they had tried and forced her towards this circular saw. I asked her how she got away, and she said, I just squirmed out of, she said, lucky I was wearing a hoodie, I squirmed out of it and ran. She said she ran out of the door, she ran across the field, and then I think after a short space of time, she turned round to look back to see that these intruders were also leaving the premises, that they'd shut the door behind them. She was then concerned about David, so she went back to the barn, and when she opened the door, suddenly, the combustion, the flames, that's what had caused the burns to her face.
While Lisa consoles her heartbroken friend, police turn up to interview Julie as a key witness to the crime.
She was only able to give some basic details. We didn't want to push too hard, of course. She's a victim. She's lost David in the most awful circumstances. Clearly the 999 call provided us with a little bit of information, which was helpful, but we wanted to try and dig deeper if we could, so we had to ask those difficult questions as early as possible. She was interviewed by specially trained officers, but sometimes it just wasn't possible to continue with interviews because Julie wasn't in a emotionally fit state to carry on at that point, so we had to do lots of short sections rather than a really long and draining and demanding interview.
With little information gleaned from Julie, and unease growing among the locals, police turned to the public for help.
In the hours that followed, Lincolnshire Police made appeals for the intruders and did reveal that a 999 call had been made by Julie Dixon and gave the description of these two masked men who had been to the workshop, and that Julie had managed to push one of them away and escape, and then rang the fire brigade on 999.
I remember holding more than one press conference, which wasn't just local and regional, it was national as well, because this was big news in terms of what had happened and where it had happened and the type of community that it was affecting.
As Lincolnshire Police continued to make these appeals, we would take that information and circulate it amongst the various radio stations, local newspapers, daily newspapers in Lincolnshire, and the police were obviously very anxious to get that message out as wide as possible.
With Lincolnshire Police desperately trying to piece together the events of the night and establish the identity of the masked men, Fire Commander Gary Milson scours the crime scene for clues.
Once the fire's been extinguished, we then start on the scene preservation side of it, and as we withdraw from the building, we're trying to make sure that anything that has been removed out of the building is logged or is placed back into the building with care, so that should we need to, we can rebuild that picture, that jigsaw puzzle, to help us find out how the fire started.
I've dealt with quite a few fires, and unfortunately fatal fires as well, and murder cases, and it's probably one of the most challenging cases that you have to deal with, because by its very nature, fire destroys evidence, not just the fire itself, but the water that's used.
Having established petrol was used as the accelerant, Senior Investigating Officer Stuart Gibbon begins trying to make sense of the scene.
All police officers and detectives are constantly reminded about how important the golden hour is. It's a time where you can lose evidence, but if you get it right and you gather the evidence and you secure and preserve that evidence, it can have a positive impact on the rest of the investigation. The golden hour in this particular investigation was kind of twofold. One was about securing the workshop to make sure that we could get access to it and that nobody else used it, and it could be forensically examined over a period of days, which it was. Also, from a financial point of view, it wasn't going to be a kind of random attack. That's something that I almost eliminated from a very early stage, simply because of where it is. So was it a customer that had been in before? And then you start to think about the reasons why. Is it financial? Is it a robbery or a burglary that's gone wrong? Did David owe somebody some money and they were trying to recover the money? So we drafted in a financial investigator working with the police, and he was starting to look at the actual basics of the business, how it was doing financially, what was going on.
Could David have been targeted for money? Was it a revenge attack for a business deal gone wrong? Or something closer to home?
So, Julie did actually send me a few messages, and she called me quite distressed, probably a couple of weeks before David was killed. She did say that her telephone had been cut off, but then was restored again. She said that her electricity had been cut off, but restored again. She felt that someone was messing around with them.
Aware that this information could be key to the investigation, Lisa contacts the police.
So we had what are known as a PULSA team, police search advisor team, specialist search officers that did a kind of fingertip search in the parameters around the building. And actually they found something which appeared quite significant, deposited in some bushes on a neighbouring piece of land next to the joinery workshop. They found some keys, and we were able to establish at a slightly later point that one of those keys fitted the storeroom that David had been locked inside. So this is quite a significant find for us. Obviously those items were forensically examined, they didn't yield any evidence, but the finding of those keys supported at that point the account that Julie Dixon had given, because they were found in the direction that the two offenders were alleged to have gone off in.
Further inquiries begin to yield some surprising discoveries.
I think the first kind of breakthrough in terms of new information for the investigation wasn't surprisingly to do with the two offenders, it was to do with the financial affairs, if you like. We'd been led to believe by the inquiries that we conducted that the business was in a good place financially, that David was doing well, and that the accounts were healthy. In actual fact, when we had a financial investigator start to look more closely at the accounts and the business, the opposite was true. They were in dire financial straits, on the verge, if not already, bankrupt, and there were some serious financial issues.
Having been unaware of the financial issues at David's business, further inquiries throw up more concerns.
The post that was going to the business was supposed to be going to David Twig Drawing, who actually had been redirected to this garage. And that was quite a big point for us as well, because then that begs the question, well, why is the post being redirected? Who's redirecting it? And what lies behind that?
In Lincolnshire, the investigation into the murder of David Twig has thrown up some suspicious activity around his business.
It soon became clear that both the workshop and the bungalow where they lived had been remortgaged.
Finances were becoming a little bit more of a priority line of inquiry, and we needed also to know why the post was being redirected to another address. We were still keeping an open mind. Obviously, we were still trying to establish these two master offenders, who they were, where they were, why they'd done what they did, but also these other things were starting to kind of build up in terms of the finances first and foremost, very, very different to how we'd initially thought they were.
While the investigation homes in on David's financial affairs and whether his death could be linked to a business deal, 2 months after his murder, David's body is released so he can finally be laid to rest. Friend Lisa accompanies David's partner Julie to the funeral.
That was a huge, big turning point for us. Suddenly my gut feeling started to take over. The funeral, she acted very strange for someone that was basically saying the last goodbye to a partner. She would crack jokes, and quite inappropriate jokes, acting slightly inappropriately towards people. She was laughing very, very loud. Then suddenly she'd be upset. It just seemed really irrational. And I felt uncomfortable.
But it isn't just friends who have their concerns. Having uncovered some financial irregularities surrounding David and Julie's business, Lincolnshire police have more questions.
Yeah, we were looking for answers to these questions, and the only person that really could probably provide them was Julie Dixon. I was conscious that we were asking her a lot of questions and being quite direct with her, when actually, on the face of it, she was a victim of the most awful circumstances. But we had to ask those questions. We weren't always given the answers we were looking for.
As well as the finances, police inquiries with David's creditors flag up something else.
All the inquiries that we carried out with the businesses and the authorities that were dealing with this financial debt, nobody had ever spoken, personally or otherwise, with David Twig. Every kind of communication, be it on the telephone, email, that sort of thing, was with Julie Dixon. And what we also uncovered, which was really quite concerning, was that people were being told by Julie that David was terminally ill, that he was abroad on holiday, that he was really unable to take any calls for various different reasons. And this concerned us because we couldn't corroborate this in any way.
Having also discovered the post addressed to David's business was being redirected to a local garage, Stuart and his team trawl through the garage's CCTV, hoping it will reveal who is behind the redirection. Instead, they find another clue.
And when we examined that CCTV, we found that Julie had driven there in a vehicle on the morning of the murder. and had filled up petrol cans with petrol at the location. And when we did challenge her with finding that information and the CCTV footage, she told us, yes, I did go to the garage that morning. We were doing some gardening and I needed to get some petrol to fill the lawnmower up. We established also that Julie had a BlackBerry type mobile phone. And as part of a murder investigation, you're always looking at mobile phone data because it can tell you a lot of things, and we couldn't get into it. So clearly we asked Julie on more than one occasion, could you please help us and tell us what the PIN number is so we can access this device? She was unable to do so. She said that she'd forgotten, she couldn't remember it. Clearly she had been using it very recently and on the day of the murder. We had evidence of that. If nobody else uses it and nobody else has changed the PIN or password, then she must know that number or that code. What's in that BlackBerry? Why won't she tell us the PIN number? We really desperately needed to get to the bottom of what had happened, and this was the point where the investigation focus really changed.
As the months tick by, friends of Julie also start to have their doubts as to what really occurred that fateful night.
One race meeting that I remember very, very clearly was the last race meeting that she's ever come to. When we arrived there was a police car there. She started screaming and hitting things, shouting at the top of her voice, making some very loud noises. And I just said, Julie, talk to me. What's wrong? Why are you upset? She sat, she rocked, she cried. She rocked, she cried. And then she started saying, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. And I just said, what are you sorry for? Tell me what you're sorry for. She rocked, she cried, I'm sorry. And it was like a repeated process. She said nothing else, she did nothing else.
While Julie spends a weekend away with friends, back at the investigation, forensic evidence starts to build up.
Now, the account Julie gave was that the two men had come in, there'd been a tussle, she'd managed to get out of the place, and she'd gone to ring 999, and then she'd noticed them running out, the two offenders, and they ran off round the back, and she went back in to try and rescue David or find him, and as she opened the door, there was a flashback, and she was hit with the fumes from the fire and the explosion, and that was how she got the injuries. Actually, forensic evidence would say otherwise, and would indicate that it was what's known as a vapour cloud.
When the petrol would be originally poured into the foyer and lit, as the petrol's ignited, the vapour cloud would ignite first, and anybody in that vicinity would get caught in that vapour cloud, and depending on the amount of vapour and the intensity of it, they may just get slight singeing and flash burns, or they could indeed get quite badly burned. That seemed to be fitting more with the burns to Julie Dixon than rather what she was telling us, that she would open the door and it flared up. In fact, we considered it quite unlikely that she had opened the door and the petrol had flared up like that. Once it's lit, it's done that initial flare up, and it's unlikely that would happen again. There was a petrol can behind the door. Had she have opened the door right at the start of the fire, she would have moved the petrol can, so that evidence didn't add up.
We also recovered from a forensic examination of the bungalow some very small hairs in the bathroom sink. Now again, on the surface, first viewing, not particularly relevant, but when we have those sent off to be forensically examined and we find out that they belong to Julie Dixon, those hairs, again, not particularly relevant, it's her bathroom, she uses a bathroom, there are going to be hairs. They were identified as eyelash or eyebrow hairs, but they were singed, they were burned. That put a kind of different slant on it as well.
Finding burned eyebrow hairs revealed Julie had gone into the bathroom after the fire had started, knowing full well her partner was trapped inside a burning building, something which raises suspicion among the police. Not only that, but the fire investigators believe Julie could only have received her injuries if she'd been inside the building when the fire started.
Julie Dixon had given various different accounts. She'd given us very little information. The more we tried to put to her by way of questions, the more withdrawn she'd become at that point, and actually became quite defensive at various times as well. And it was at that point that I made the decision, based on all the anomalies and the significant findings, she was going to be arrested on suspicion of the murder of her partner, David.
3 months after David's death, and news of Julie's arrest soon spreads around her hometown.
Obviously, there had been a lot of anxiety and fright in the community about intruders being at large. So in some ways, the arrest of Julie put that to bed. But equally, there was also some anger that obviously they'd spent 3 months believing Julie's story.
There was a lot of upset people. She had upset a lot of people because she befriended, well, she was everybody's friend. She was a very likeable person. And yeah, it was a big shock to everybody.
Julie Dixon is brought into the police station for formal questioning, this time as a suspect, not as a witness.
I was prepared, I thought, for most things to come from that interview, including a no-comment interview, which is quite common. So we'd gathered together as a group, the interviewing officers, the SO, the interview coordinator, to discuss what could happen, but what actually did happen, it's fair to say, threw us all at that point. She provided a prepared statement, and what it said in a nutshell was that this whole situation had been a suicide pact. So what she said was that both her and David had wanted to die due to the dire financial circumstances around the business and personal issues, and that they were preparing to do just that, but that when the crunch came to lighting the petrol and setting the fire, she panicked and ran out of the building, leaving David behind.
In Lincolnshire, police are questioning David Twigg's partner on suspicion of his murder.
My initial thoughts were that if Julie was prepared to lie about two masked raiders and invent a story around what had actually happened, then what else had she lied about?
In interview, Julie claims the fire was a joint suicide pact, but that she had panicked and fled. So police need to establish if there is any truth in her account.
Let's go back and speak to friends and family. What sort of state of mind was David in? And actually, fairly quickly, it was established that he was in a good state of mind. He had no idea, we think, that the business was in such dire straits. He had no reason to die.
There's no way that David in his right mind would do a suicide pact, because he loved life too much and he was enjoying it too much. You know, the weeks before he got killed, he was down with us, enjoying it, planning the next year, the next trips, where we were going. He would never had that in his back of his mind. So we knew for ourselves then that she was bonkers, and she had done it, and she was now trying to get herself out of her murder.
Suddenly, here we are. It's now a suicide pact. And who has a suicide pact but's locked behind a door that they don't have the key to, so they couldn't even change their mind if they wanted to? Poor David died on his hands and knees in a praying position, leaning against a door that was locked from the outside. That's not a suicide pact.
With time running out to hold Julie Dixon without charge, Senior Investigating Officer Stuart Gibbon consults with the Crown Prosecution Service.
So we clearly were very concerned about this prepared statement and just felt that it was probably another way of shifting focus. We've had the masked offenders, they no longer exist now, so now we're going to go down the suicide pact, which is, interestingly enough, is a partial defence to murder, and if found to be true, could result in a conviction for manslaughter rather than murder. So that kind of made sense at that point. We had CPS working with us, so we could talk to them about the content of that prepared statement. They were already fully au fait with the evidence that we'd gathered that far. And the CPS lawyer was happy at that point that there was sufficient evidence to provide a realistic prospect for conviction. So the decision was made to charge Julie Dixon with murdering her partner David Twigg.
With Dixon charged with murder, police and CPS prepare for trial, and part of that means trying to establish a motive. Why would Julie want David dead?
The main strands of evidence, really, there were quite a few bits of circumstantial as well, the petrol and the redirection of the post, but the main ones were really the finances. We found out that they were in dire straits. What I think is that it was getting to the point where a warrant was issued for non-payment of fines. The bailiffs were going to turn up at the workshop at some point. That is the stage where David would become aware of the scale of this debt, in fact the debt existed at all maybe, and Julie Dixon could then hold that back no longer. That's where it was all going to come to a head.
As well as discovering the couple were in serious financial trouble, police now had CCTV proving Julie purchased petrol on the day of the murder. But it's forensic evidence of a computer found in the couple's workshop, which really helps build the case for the prosecution.
We'd heard stories that she'd been Googling stuff on a laptop, claiming that David had been Googling stuff. How do you commit suicide with it being undetectable
She was Googling on her laptop how to poison someone with cakes and how to get away with murder.
As the trial approaches, Julie Dixon changes her story yet again.
Things kind of changed a little bit again when Julie Dixon then started to say that it wasn't a suicide pact. Actually, David did want to die, and she was just trying to help him along, basically. So she's trying to remove herself even further from any kind of blame whatsoever. You know, it was David's idea. David wanted to do it. I just kind of helped him. Things had changed hugely since the first 999 call to the emergency services, but we felt we had a strong case. On the second day of that hearing, the not guilty plea, which had been entered initially by Julie Dixon, changed to a guilty plea, but she still maintained at that point that this had been all about David wanting to die. That's what the defence was putting forward, whereas our defence was cold-blooded, premeditated, pre-planned murder.
With Julie's shocking confession, the trial is halted.
Once Julie Dixon had admitted her guilt and pleaded guilty to David's murder, the role of the jury was no longer needed, but then falls to the judge to decide on what basis he believes her plea and on what basis the killing was carried out. So this is what is called a Newton hearing, and the judge hears evidence from all the parties in the case, and it's in the judge's role to decide how the murder was carried out effectively.
The prosecution lays out its case to the judge, and Julie's 999 call is played to the court.
The characters and set fire to the place.
The place that set fire?
Yeah.
Is it the building that's on fire?
It is, yeah.
It is, okay then.
I got out. I managed to get the
Right.
It's
okay. Is everybody out of the building?
No, there's still my partner in.
The phone call, on the face of it, sounded very genuine. She sounded distraught. She was hysterical. But actually, the first information imparted was more of an account about what they'd been doing, like a rehearsal, rather than just saying, I need help and I need help quickly.
Over 5 days, the court hears how Julie's account changed throughout the investigation. From masked intruders to a joint suicide pact, to her assisting David in his own bid to take his own life.
The defence argued, once Julie Dixon had pleaded guilty, that matters had spiralled out of control and that in some ways this had been an emotional response from Julie Dixon, almost that she had panicked because of the financial difficulties she got into. However, I think from the prosecution's point of view and certainly from the police point of view, this was a perpetrator who had changed her account whenever it had suited her, whenever she had been confronted with new evidence. There was always a line of defence, so it's hard not to see her really as a very skillful and manipulative liar.
Julie Dixon didn't take the stand at all, didn't give evidence, was again very impassive, didn't present any emotion at any stage of the court proceedings, merely sat in the dock and appeared to be listening to the proceedings.
The extent of the couple's financial difficulties is revealed to the judge.
David wouldn't have had a clue about that bankruptcy. He was quite happy going about his everyday business. I think if he had found out that he had been declared bankrupt, he would have been incredibly upset, being such a proud man. So, yeah, she obviously kept that from him. And I can't see that those finances would have been enough for anyone to lose their life over.
At the end of that hearing, Judge Heath had to decide whose account he believed, and he came firmly down on David Twigg's side and said that he in no way believed that David Twigg had wanted to commit suicide, and he described Julie Dixon's account as a pack of lies.
The judge was quite damning in his comments and quite clear that he thought it was a cold-blooded murder and that, she'd been kind of playing the part and it was potentially worthy of an Oscar nomination if it hadn't been so sad and so true.
Julie Dixon is sentenced to life with a minimum of 23 years for the murder of David Twigg. 11 years on, he is still remembered fondly.
No sentence can ever bring back a loved one. It will never be enough, of course, and it will never bring David back. But I just hope it brings some little comfort to the loved ones and those who love David so much.
It just beggars belief that anyone would do that to another human being, a living person, someone you're supposed to care about, your partner. It's just incredibly difficult to understand how anyone would do that.
I think the harder thing is to wrap your head around is the way she calculated it, how she planned it all. What else was she planning? What else was she thinking? They say it's down to money. We'll never know. Obviously, she don't care about anybody because she did what she did. So no one will ever know what's going through her head.
This investigation in this case impacted hugely on the community and the village of Burla Marsh. You know, people aren't going to forget what happened. It lives with them forever, and whenever the name of the village is sometimes mentioned, people will talk about this case. I know I certainly will never forget it.